Tim, welcome to Watch You On, and thanks for logging on. Well, it's Watchmaker Wednesday, and it's March, so in anticipation of our very own March Madness, I can't offer you the Final Four, but I can offer you the fabulous five. We have the five principal ETA calibers here with us tonight, and Mr. Mike Michaels to shed light on the topic.
How's everyone doing?
Everyone's doing great out in cyberspace. I can see that we've already got folks logging on. Longfinger, Mac, Federico joining us, actually present in the studio. And of course, Kaizen, Eric, welcome guys. So here's the thing with ETA. ETA is a large conglomerate movement maker that's owned by the Swatch Group. By some estimates, they comprise 10% of the entire value of the Swiss watch industry by themselves. And not only are they that, but they are effectively they're like a snowball that's rolled up so many different manufacturers and watch calibers over the years. And quite honestly, it's gone from a snowball to like a mini avalanche. So Mike, let's start with the most basic and oldest caliber that we've got here, which is the
6497.
Yeah.
Start off as a Unitas movement. This is what you're going to see in your manual wine Panerais, the non-in-house versions.
Yes.
And it's really a great movement. And at the time when the movement came out, it was basically considered a pocket watch size movement. 16 line, but it's a beautiful movement. It's really well done, well finished. Panerai did a fantastic job. Just their finish on it is very nice. They increased the beat, as you were mentioning earlier. They increased the beat. They increased the power reserve on it from the base movement. Really a good movement, strong movement, fun to service because they're predictable.
And first of all, it's the oldest. It debuted in 1950, and Unitas is an old watch brand that in the 1930s was rolled up into a Bausch's SA, which became sort of the earliest iteration of ETA commercially. And so they created this movement, like you said, to be everything from a pocket watch caliber to a
desk
power
clock,
plant for a desk clock.
For anything that'll take.
And it kind of found second wind in the modern era as like a school watch for student watchmakers.
Yeah, we use this we do events. We sit people down, we'll sit clients down and actually have them take the watch apart and put it back together, and they are astonished they can actually take a watch down as far as they can and put it back together and the watch will still run. It's actually a fun thing to watch somebody do that has never picked up a pair of tweezers or a screwdriver. And it's a great one too, because like you mentioned, 16 lean, so a lean is roughly like 2.25 millimeters. So if you work it out, the 16 lean 6497 movement by itself is bigger than a Rolex 36mm Datejust, which is pretty spectacular. But it also had sort of a second life as a big movement for modern oversized watches that had display casebacks. We actually have a somewhat more primitive version, a less elaborated earlier version of a 6497. And you can see how in the modern era, when people want to see their movements, before watchmakers started designing custom movements and in-house movements, this was an off-the-shelf option for cases that were just bigger than all get out. Yeah, and the thing is, too, it went through a transition where the movement was big. It was almost too big for a wristwatch, like we said, so they put them in desk clocks, everything else. But then now with the resurgence of large watches, and Panerai and Maurice Lacroix, I think were the first ones to really start using it in production, to actually use the watch and make bigger size watches. I remember working on Panerai and Maurice Lacroix years ago when we look at these things and they're huge. Who wants a watch that big? But now they're everywhere, and that's the size of a watch.
And it had gotten to the point where pretty much no one but students and student watchmakers were using it, and the movement just found a second life. First in those display caseback oversized watches, and then second as we moved into the era of in-house movements throughout the watch industry, not just at brands like Rolex and Grand Seiko, but smaller manufacturers, we started to see the 6497 become effectively an engineering template for other brands to build their own in-house movements. All of the licensing and copyright and intellectual property material on this movement,
so old.
It expired before I was born.
Right. So there's so many different variations of when you just compare the two we have here. You see the train layout is the same. The bridge design is entirely different, though.
What's interesting is with Maurice Lacroix, when they started launching their in-house calibers with the ML150 manual wines and the ML180 and 190 series, you started to see a brand take the essential geometry, roughly just where the wheels are in relation to each other, where the pallet is in relation to the escape wheel,
It's like they start with
yeah.
the main plate. They'll start with the main plate and they redo the bridges and they do a full 3/4 bridge
Yes.
design on theirs where everything is covered. I say 3/4 bridge, that means 3/4 of the movement is covered. You don't have separate bridges for the train wheels and for the barrel bridge. This is one single plate. A full bridge would cover everything all the way across.
And so Pheline has the image up, but Maurice Lacroix even made an automatic version of this.
And it works. Surprisingly enough, it works.
Honestly, I'm impressed by what Maurice Lacroix does when you make your movement parts, your movements, and your own cases, plus you manage to automatize a old pocket watch movement. You've got my respect.
Yeah, one of the things they do too is on the retrograde movements.
Yes.
Under the dial, they are really, really beautifully done. You know, Maurice Lacroix, because of the price point, they don't get a great reputation, you know, in the collector field. They should, because under the dial, their finish is so beautiful. And it's stuff that you'll never see. It's a nice looking watch, especially now too with the size of the watch. It's a full size watch.
Yeah.
You know, they wear so well. But the retrogrades, the jumps, and all that stuff, the way the springs all work, just for all the flybacks, they're really, really well done.
And so it's also important to note that for smaller manufacturers, like one-man bands like Pascal Coyon of France, I believe Pheline has a great image of his iteration of the 6497, which is done up with full-blown individual train finger bridges, basically. And this is an example of a guy who's basically kind of like a man after your own heart.
Yeah, he took it about as far as you can go. You know, and it's just he re-engineered the whole thing. When you talk about, you mentioned school watches too.
Yeah.
I know they're still using these in school watches over in Europe.
Yes.
They're still using the same thing. They're manufacturing stems. Students are making stems out of them. They have to make the balance cock. They have to make the train wheel bridges, and a lot of them that are made, they're making 3/4 plates. I've seen some absolutely beautiful work done. Back when Wolfstep, before they were using Rolex movements, they were also using the 6497, and you had to make the entire train bridge. So I've seen a lot of really nice school watches come out of here.
So not just were watchmakers trained on the movement, but in many cases the culminating experience of their education was actually the ability to recreate a 6497. And actually, I'm going to be going to a, American AWCI instructional on the 6497 in July, so I'll report back on everything I saw when I go there. Okay, so this is a question coming in from Brian Gross, excuse me. Brian Gross is asking, hey Mike, could you compare and contrast specific mods that big name ETA modders make to their ETA movements like Sin, IWC, Panerai, or Tudor? Now, we're going to get to the Distrero. Maybe we should hold that question a little bit.
Yeah, let's hold that, and we'll discuss the Tudor as well, because they do make a couple changes. A couple of different brands, they make changes, mostly to the escapement, to the balance itself, to regulation. Okay. You know, and the same thing with IWC, Tudor. They use different regulation. They don't go to the free sprung like Omega does on the coaxial, but they do changes.
Okay. So the nice thing about ETA is also that it really doesn't retire any calibers. Everything just sort of stays in circulation forever. And that brings us to basically the era of the automatic watch. And the oldest surviving automatic architecture in the ETA family is actually the 2824, or as I like to call it, the champion, because an example of this movement adjusted by Tissot has consistently placed with the likes of Grubel Force, Jaeger-LeCoultre, boutique tourbillon manufacturers in the Leloc chronometry competition that's held every 2 years, 2009, 2011, 2013. And the 2824 is consistently up there. How's that possible, Mike?
It's a fantastic movement. It's still one of my favorite movements. You don't see it used as much anymore. Tissot, as you mentioned, is really using it. They have an 80-hour version now. That they're getting really good results. Free sprung. It's a very good movement. It's a strong movement. The only drawback is it's a little thick as compared to the 2892. One other thing you'll notice too, it has two reversing wheels, where the 2892 has one reversing wheel. So when you go to wind this watch, because of the mainspring and the size of the barrel too, you actually feel the difference. The mainspring is much taller. So you actually feel the difference when you go to wind a 2824. You could feel more resistance than a regular 2892.
Now the example I'm showing you here, just full disclosure, it's on a Ball Trainmaster. This is actually the 2836 version, and because you've got that day date, and because a day aperture jumps every 24 hours, this is the same base that's used for GMT versions of the 2824.
Yeah, they do the same thing, and they just change the instead of a day wheel.
Now, I actually happen to like the 2824 a great deal because, like Mike said, both the 2892 and the 2824 are tough, but it almost seems like the 2824, about a millimeter thicker, is double tough. Plus, it's also very accurate. Now, you could honestly say that between the 7750 and the 2824, Breitling is the house that they built in the modern era.
Breitling uses those right now, the 2824, I think more than anybody else. They do a great finish on it. They also, Breitling again is known for everything is COSC certified. So everything comes through, everything's regulated better. For all the ETAs, they offer different grades of them. We talked about this a couple times in one of the other shows. And it's everything from the finish of the bridges, finish to the screws, finish to the wheels, to the balance. And the difference in the balance is huge. You have a regular, non-chronometer grade balance that actually has a different arm configuration, or you have a chronometer grade balance that has like hourglass balance arms. And the price difference is about 4 times between the two balances. And are they interchangeable? Yeah, they are. Can you get great numbers out of a non-chronometer? Yes, we had to get certified.
And of course, it's also important to note that you can do truly like mind-warping things with the 2824 in chronometer grade. I mean, when you can go up against the likes of JLC, Grubel, Force, and Louis Monet with their top-of-the-line watches against a 2824 that probably cost ETA $11 to make.
One of the other things too, and we talk about the numbers, all the ETA, all the current ETAs, and we're talking about 6497 all the way to the 7750, everything. They're all using the Etachron regulation system, which also that helps allow you to get those numbers. It's a it's a 2-part regulation system where you can actually it changes by opening and closing the regulator pins. You don't actually have to bend anything as you do with fixed regulator pins. You have a key that you can open and close the regulator pins, which will adjust, speed up or slow down the watch on plane. Because when you time the watch dial up and dial down, that's one thing, but when you turn on the plane, the watch, you also want the watch to run within 8 seconds of its dial up and dial down.
Yeah, and so the Etachron can be used to adjust both timing and beat rate.
It's timing, it's beat rate and timing on the plane. That's what it's used for. It's for bringing, because you're not going to change your timing when you're in flat positions. Your timing is your timing. But you're going to go ahead and when you turn it on its side and you get your regulation, you take your regulation in 3 positions there, we're taking the average out of those. But to use that Etachron, we can open or close it if I'm running fast, crown down, dial, or, as opposed to dial up or dial down, then I'm going to go ahead and open up those regulating pins, and that's going to effectively slow the watch down. Then you bring the rate back up again, and that goes ahead and brings everything back into...
Just so I can add a visual to what Mike's talking about, there are 2 lozenge-shaped plugs on top of the regulator mechanism, on top of the balance, and those 2 lozenge-shaped plugs, one of them's gold, one of them's silver, are adjusted with an Etachron key.
Etachron tool, yeah. And the silver one is actually the stud, and that's the end of the hairspring, and the gold one is actually the regulator pins.
And so good is ETA's manufacturing that a lot of people have said that you can get a high-grade Etachron tuned movement and just leave both of them perfectly centered and it'll keep pretty good time. And that's one of the reasons I respect ETA so much. A lot of people gripe that it's a generic movement, and I have to say, if you've got a Le Mans 24-hour winning Chevy small block V8, it doesn't matter that everyone and his brother has a small block. That one's a champion.
Yeah, the movements are great. They're workhorses. All the ETA movements are. The 2824 has always been a favorite of mine, not just because I had to do it when we were in testing in school for certifications, but it's always been a fun movement for me to work on. And actually, to me, it's always looked a lot like the 3035 Rolex. I've always compared the two. They're just as strong. They're great movements though.
And it is worth mentioning that even the 2824 is about 2 millimeters thinner than the 3135. So let me throw this out too. Both the 2824 and 2892 are descended from Eterna movements.
Yes.
Now Eterna is best known as the company that unintentionally spawned the monster ETA. ETA was broken off as a movement sort of specialist within Eterna in the late 20s and gradually became an entity unto itself separate from Eterna. But in roughly like 1960, the 2824 was spawned off an Eterna caliber, and then in the early 70s, we came to know the more sophisticated and thinner version known as it was originally the 2890, today it's the 2892. And this is a base 2892. that's been upgraded.
The easiest thing to notice on it when you're looking at the case back is you have a flat oscillating weight, and you have a larger bearing, a much larger bearing. The bearing itself, instead of being held in with the one screw, as the 2824 has, it's held in with 3 screws from the underside of the oscillator, or the automatic bridge. They're very tiny screws. And you just see the screw heads, you don't see the screw, you don't see the slots. You see the tip of the screw, I should say.
It's a much more compact movement, and if you're trying to read the tea leaves, if you don't know precisely what they look like, or you only have a jewel listing for a watch and there's no display case back, it's a little bit surprising that the more modern caliber, the 2892, actually has fewer jewels, typically 21 jewels to the 25 of the more, at least more mechanically complex 2824.
Well, I think most of that's in the automatic.
Yeah.
It's because you do twin reversing wheels and everything's jeweled through the automatic bridge. Where the 2892, it's actually posted. There's 2 posts in there instead where they don't run on jewels.
I actually think in the 2892, the automatic system is sort of a well that's inserted into the movement.
Yeah, actually, it has one very iconic screw on a 2824 that actually drops in and kind of locks everything together for torque.
So now, I am actually going to do a wrist check right now because tonight I'm wearing my 2892 derivative. This is the Omega chronometer caliber 1120 here. And it's actually in my graduation watch from back in 2002, and it's the Bond Seamaster. This is the well-known SMP 300, old 41.5 steel pre-coaxial. And this is a chronometer grade 2892. And I've crashed this thing on a bike. I've savaged it. It was with me through combat swim in the Navy. It's a great movement, and it's tough as nails. And again, it just proves how far you can take that basic movement, because this thing, when it's serviced, will keep time to 1 second a day.
Right, and they changed a little bit when Omega, on their versions, we're not even talking about the coaxial, they changed a little bit in the automatic. The oscillating weight's a little thicker, it's a little bigger, it has more mass on the outside edge, which they put extra steps in the train bridge to accommodate for it. They changed the automatic bridge as well. The orientation of the wheels, it has an extra plate. It's just some small intricacies. Parts are pretty much interchangeable on the base models. Again, we're not talking about anything coaxial. That's a whole different animal.
Yeah, there's a 23, you'll note that the typical 289282 is a 21 jewel. The caliber 1120 in the Omegas is a 23. They did change a few things. So they took some liberties, and I remember back then us SMP collectors used to like hang our hats on that. It's not the exact same thing. They changed it. So I want to answer...
Not that much.
Exactly. Yeah, fortunately, they kept all the good stuff. There's a question coming in from David, and he's asking, how good is the Sellita SW200? Since we're still pretty close to our talk about the 2824, let's cover that.
Yeah, SW200 is the 2824. That's the replacement for the 2824. But the SW300 is the replacement for the 2892, and SW500 7750. It's made differently. Its parts are not interchangeable. Instead of the bridge is actually being pinned, the main plate is actually studded, so the bridges slide over the pins. I've seen good and bad. I've seen some of them come out of the factory with the jewels just not set right, bad end shakes. I've actually seen jewels upside down. But at the same time, you know, it's a decent replacement movement. You know, and when you can't get the movements, it works.
It becomes a very in-depth question because there are chronometer grade SW200s and SW300s, the 2892 equivalent, floating around, which means watch brands are taking delivery of them and making substantial changes. And Mike saw that. You saw that at Hublot.
Yeah, Hublot used the SW300s a lot and SW500s. We saw those, and we saw, you know, some of them came out with like a blasted finish on them, but other ones came out highly finished, and there's really no rhyme or reason as to how they went.
But you also saw that a lot of in-house correction goes on to bring them to a high standard, and that varies from brand to brand.
In-house correction, and we also saw a lot of after-sale service as well, you know, corrections in them. Where one of the main things that I remember seeing, and I don't know if it was just in a production run, but it was almost that either the jewels were manufactured, you know, a thousandth of a millimeter too small, or the holes were machined a little too large. But I've seen jewels move easier in the Sellita movements than they do in the ETAs.
It's also worth mentioning that the Swiss supply chain is a complex one, and this could just as easily have been a problem with one of Sellita's suppliers.
That's what I mean. You know, it's just getting in one production run. that we just happen to see quite a few of. We did a lot of jewel adjusting though for a while.
Now we have a question coming in from Matthew Madden saying first time commenter, so welcome. Welcome Matthew, and you're asking what are our thoughts on the Omega 8900 coaxial master chronometer. So there was the 8500 that came out in 2007, and over time it gained silicon hairspring. It became more sophisticated, brought in that materials innovation that Swatch Group was investing in, and then it turned into the 8900 with the introduction of the fully cased up Maytaz chronometer test.
Great movements. You know, again, when I talk about the 8500 family, you know, that's where I kind of, you know, group them all together because of the base movement. Talk about it all the time. It's a fantastic movement. It took a while to get the bugs worked out of it.
Yeah.
Once they did, that whole family of movements are fantastic. They're a little thick, but they're great movements.
Yeah, they took a cue from Rolex. It's okay to have a thick movement in a sports watch. People will appreciate the lack of problems. And, you know, it's just important to note that Maytaz is everything COSC was, plus a cased up test of things like, obviously, precision. Things change when you clamp a movement into the case.
It certainly does.
Also, water resistance and properties that the COSC simply doesn't test. So it's everything COSC is plus more, which is why we like the basic caliber, we like the COSC test, but we really love the Maytaz thing. Only you can decide whether or not you want to pay a premium for it, though, but the substance is there. Now, I think just for fun, I'm going to throw this out. This has nothing to do with ETA. This is
It's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is one of those, as Federico likes to say, master of the universe watches. This is your Audemars Piguet reference 26288. This is your Royal Oak Offshore tourbillon chronograph with 10-day power reserve. Okay, not quite. It's 237 hours, but believe me, we're splitting hairs here. You might just wind it a little bit, get it out to 10 days. It's a chronograph, it's a tourbillon, it weighs half a pound, it's rose gold, it's got a forged carbon bezel, it's got ceramic pusher inserts. What can I say? It has a $300,000 retail price. So that's just there. That's some eye candy because we're not going to submerge you with ETA. But we are going to move on to our next caliber, which is the chronograph perhaps we don't talk about enough. It's not the 7750, it's its 2892 based in-house brethren, the 2894.
The 2894 is ETA's version. It's not a DD module. It's entirely different. It has 3 vertical clutches, a lot less moving parts, a lot of springs. It's a movement we service here, and I kind of like the movement. I like servicing it. Because it's pretty predictable, but it also has some problems. If you don't have the proper tooling, you need special tooling to actually assemble the movement, to hold the springs back. You have an assembly jig to put the movement on, assemble it. You only have one adjustment, and that's on the reset. You have tension adjustment. That's the only thing there is. There's no hammer adjustments or anything else.
Now, what I have here is actually the, it makes for a great compact chronograph assembly because even though it's modular, because it's based on the 2892, it still winds up being slimmer than a 7750.
Right.
It's also very versatile because you can arrange the dial a couple of different ways, having the modular chronograph, and you can also keep all the intrinsic values of the 2892, the hacking function, the quick set, the reliability, the bidirectional winding, so it doesn't have that rotor wobble that you get with a 7750. Right. And it's about a 40 to 42 hour power reserve, so standard stuff, but tough, relatively compact, and with the vertical clutches, a little bit more efficient than a standard lateral clutch chronograph.
One of the things, if you ever wonder what's inside the watch, if you don't have a display case back and you don't know if it says, because this actually is labeled by the balance, 2894, not 2892. You'll see 2892s with the module on top of it, and those are going to be DD modules. When you see one of these, if you ever wonder what it is, you can start the chronograph and go to set your hands. And if your hour recorder starts going with your hands, it's a 2894.
Yeah, and like Mike said, there are little ways you can tell. Always important to note where the constant seconds is on a watch. In general, when you see constant seconds sitting at 3 o'clock, that's some sort of modular chronograph. Yeah. So
you also have the step too. When you talk about that, you have the step and the crowns. We've talked about that a lot. You've got the where everything's not in plane because you actually have the module where you see the pushers. That's actually the module on top of the base movement. Or if you look at the crown, that's on the bottom.
Now, it's also important to note that probably the most famous family of watches to come with this movement, because this one's a little bit under the radar. It's not the celebrated case the 7750 is, for better or worse. but probably the Speedy Reduced, and you knew the Speedy Reduced from about 1988 to 2009. The Schumacher variants helped to resurrect Omega as a brand during the 90s, back when they really needed to recover from the quartz crisis. They recovered slower than other brands, and Jean-Claude Biver back then was running Omega, and he understood that star power was marketing power. So you remember the Schumachers with their colorful dials. They were all built in the reduced case. They had the 2894 under the hood.
Yeah, 289. They used 2894. I believe didn't someone have DDs in them as well?
Yeah, they were basically cranking up production to the point where they were using
3220s, the 3220 module. Which again, we talk about modules. We talk about them all the time on here. That's one of the modules I really enjoy overhauling. It's one of the things I enjoy servicing.
Yeah, so if you want to find a great collectible watch with the 2894, look for an old Schumacher. And again, compared to subsequent Schumacher watches from other brands, cough, cough, this is a rather accessible way to get into the world of Michael's memorabilia. And I do mean Michael Schumacher, not Mike Michaels. if you want a Mike Michaels watch, we've got something here. We'll show you. We'll show you sidebar. Okay, so going through the questions, question coming from Mark. He's saying he accidentally dropped his IWC Mark 17 on an oak kitchen floor while putting it on about waist high. It's running slow. Do you think this is a calibration issue, damage? Should it be looked at?
Well, the good thing is you dropped it on a wood floor. The wood floor actually has a little bit of cushion to it. If you would have dropped it on ceramic, you probably would have broke something. Depending on the way the watch drops, the watch could speed up, the watch could slow down. If it speeds up excessively, your hairspring could have been hooked, but you're saying the watch slowed down. It could be something as simple as a regulation. Again, it depends too on how old your watch is, because by the time we get into starting to regulate that watch, then we could be getting into more problems, and you could be, in for a service if you're due for a service. And that actually be a good time to take care of both. If the watch is a few years old, then yeah, it could be a simple regulation where the regulating pins just actually moved a little bit, and if they moved closer to the stud, your regulating pins, it moves closer to the stud, it's going to slow that watch down.
Yeah, that's why I often say, almost robotically, when I talk about free-sprung watches in my wrist reviews, I say something along the lines of, and a free-sprung balance, which is more resistance to shock-induced timing deviation. And that's exactly what appears to have happened here with a non-free-sprung balance. So 2 questions coming in. One's from Don Rogan, and one is from Christopher. I'm going to shoot for Christopher's question. What about the 2836? You take the Breitling B01. The 2836, we actually just spoke about that one because we've got one on the table tonight. You can see the classical profile of those twin reversing wheels in the winding system, and of course all of the functionality that defines it as a 3.6 is on this side, where it has the date, and of course it's the presence of the day window, which moves in 24-hour cycles, that defines this as a 2836. So that could just as easily be a 24-hour GMT hand, which is why you often see this movement, which is tough and accurate and easily serviced on dual-time watches.
Right.
So now Breitling B01, Mike, this is from Don Rogan.
The B01. It's Breitling's replacement for the 7750. It is a modular chronograph, which means it's not the same modular chronograph. It's a modular chronograph by construction, where you can separate the movement. You can separate the chronograph from the base movement once you pull the hands. We've talked about that a lot. We talk about pretty much a B01 every week. It had some growing pains when it first came out, and an indication of that is the first 2 years of B01s, they only carried a 2-year warranty. So now the newer B01s, they're carrying a 5-year warranty, and they pretty much upgraded all the problems. As they had problems when they came out, they had problems with the automatic, they had problems with the chronograph, the minute recorder, a whole litany of issues that even though it went through R&D, this stuff wasn't known until it was on the wrist. Out in the field, when they have thousands of watches on wrist, what better way to test a watch than field test it like that? And then they come back and they build a database of what they have to upgrade. As I talk about a B01, if you have a B01 that needs service, right now Breitling is still the only one servicing it, and the reason for it is when you send that watch in, they're going to upgrade it to the newest version automatically. They're going to go ahead and put all the new parts into that watch. And I don't know the exact number right now, but it's got to be like a half a dozen, everything from wheels to levers to springs. They're going to go ahead and replace a lot of stuff out of service, whether the watch is under warranty or anything else. As far as the movement itself, I haven't worked on it enough. I've only done a couple of them. I haven't worked on it enough to say whether I like it or not. I like the modular idea where you could take the whole chronograph off with the wheels and the pinions in and everything. That's kind of nice because it's easier to change your barrel, stuff like that. So the idea is there. Whether or not it's as serviceable as everybody says it is, like I said, I haven't done enough of them yet to know.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically just a teething thing. We always, people always ask me questions about Rolex, and they ask Mike questions about the Breitling B01. It's just the repeating cycle. People have a lot of questions because of the history of both. In the case of the B01, you know, the teething problems are normal. Every movement has them, but when you've got something like the 6497, you know, these were pretty much rectified when my mom was 2.
Yeah.
So you just don't remember. As far as anyone like living and working on watches today recalls, it's only ever been a bulletproof caliber, and maybe we'll feel the same way about the B01 in 20, 30, 40 years. Now, a question coming from Random Rob. He's asking, Hamilton H ETA, what did they alter? I believe you're talking about the 80-hour power reserve. There were 2 principal changes. One was they slowed the rate of the watch. They went from 4 hertz to 3, so fewer oscillations, you're going to get a longer power reserve. That's why it's hard to get a long power reserve out of a high beat movement. Lower the beat and you suddenly get free power reserve. Second, they did increase the size of the barrel and the mainspring.
Right, and I'm not sure if certain if the Hamilton has it, because I know the Tissot actually has free sprung. They went to a free sprung balance on it. I'm not certain if the Hamilton did as well.
It's basically a family of calibers based on the 2824 that's used across a couple of brands within the Swatch group. So I do believe what is present on the Tissot is present on the Hamilton and vice versa. But for the most part, reduced rate, bigger mainspring barrel. Okay, so we have a gentleman joining us from Germany. Good evening in Germany, and thank you for staying up late to watch us. We have a great follow-up to the 2894, and this is the all-time champion, the most famous / infamous movement in all of watchmaking. You love it, you hate it, you can't ignore it. It's the Valjoux ETA 7750. Mike, where the heck did this movement come from?
It originally started out as a manual wind movement, and you still see it. Who's using it right now? Younker's movement using it? I believe it's a manual wind.
Yeah, the original version of the watch was a Venus 188 chronograph. Now, Venus built everything from relatively simple cam-operated chronographs to almost artisanal pieces that, you know, are still coveted today. But the 188 was a cam chronograph, and in the early 60s, Venus was purchased by Valjoux. Later, Valjoux, I talked about that Swiss snowball, was conglomerated and basically absorbed into ETA. So we call this the ETA 7750, but sequentially it was the Venus 188, the Valjoux 7733 manual wind chronograph, and then there's sort of a reverse modularity to it. It's an integrated chronograph. The part that was tacked on wasn't the chrono, it was the automatic. And in 1971, it became the Valjoux 7750.
Right, and we've talked about, you know, to go back to the B01 comment, how is the B01 as a movement? Well, if you look back to the early 1970s and you ask people how this movement was, nobody liked it. Nobody liked to work on it. It had so many problems. It took a lot of years for them to get the problems worked out of it. Back when it was a Valjoux, back when it was a 17 joule ETA, 7750, they had a lot of problems with it. Even the old Breitlings that have this, if you send that watch in, they're going to upgrade it to a 25 joule movement just because that 17 joule movement is so hard to make reliable. They have so many things, so many parts have been upgraded. It was notorious for having a bad automatic, the bad driving wheel. And if we could do a shot right in here, and if we lay it just like that, yep, the little copper colored wheel right in here, that's the one the pinion actually breaks loose off of. And what happens is, because it's a single directional wind, when you go and the watch is at full wind, if you move it the wrong way, the oscillating weight starts spinning one way, then all of a sudden it catches the other way and it actually breaks that wheel loose. I haven't seen one broken in a long time. The wheel's bronze now, it's not brass anymore. They made that a lot stronger. But there's been other issues with the watch that still continue to this day. We're talking about, you know, almost 50 years, and that's the date driving wheel. One of the biggest mistakes you can make with a 7750 is to use your calendar quick set anytime between 10 and 2, because you have a fixed pin on your date driving wheel, and that wheel just shears off. It shears off, it breaks loose, and one of the biggest things we always check for when we're buying a watch is, what does the calendar change? And I'm not talking about a couple of minutes changing late. We're talking, it's for whatever reason, it's always 3, 4 o'clock. You'll see the calendar change at 4 o'clock. That means you have a bad day drive wheel, and that's an overhaul.
So in other words, there was a long period of growing pains from the Valjoux 7750, but there's also good elements. The watch featuring a 7750 is universally serviceable. And the
Absolutely.
movement itself proved to be more versatile in a perverse fashion than anyone ever imagined, because the 7750, a manual chronograph that had a modular automatic added to it, was later shorn of its chronograph components and became an automatic widely used as a... Exactly. If you've heard of the Panerai caliber OP3, it's a Valjoux 7750 with the chronograph parts ripped off.
Yep.
That's why you have that rotor wobble on older Panerai automatics, because it's literally a dechronoed 7750. It was that economical to build, such that you could throw out half the movement, stuff it in a case, and it would be an acceptable automatic caliber on a time-only watch.
Yeah, one of the interesting things too, when they made the change on it, the A05, A07, when they made the change on the model, they changed the calendar mechanism too. So it doesn't have the same problems that the base 7750 has, and that actually made it a little bit thinner as well.
And it is a thick movement because the automatic system was basically tacked on to a standard existing caliber. You wind up with an almost 8mm thick movement, which in the world of calibers, I mean, I've got
It's
a JLC dress watch that's a full 2mm thinner than that movement, so it's pretty extreme. Now, I will say this though. Individual brands and artisans have done amazing things to redeem the 7750. A great example is the caliber 18680, basically 1868 plus a 0, that was used to mark the 125th anniversary of IWC back in 1993. Now, this Il Destriero Scafusia watch may be the most complicated timepiece ever built on a 7750 base. It's got it all. The grand complication elements, the torb, the split second, the perpetual calendar, the minute repeater. How about all four built on a 7750? Not just built, but decorated exquisitely to the point where I don't think the original engineers who grafted that auto onto the Venus 188 would recognize this. So again, sometimes you don't judge a movement by what it is inherently, but so much you judge it as a canvas and you judge it by its potential, and this one has a lot.
Yeah, it is a workhorse movement. Again, there's millions and millions of these movements out there. It's very serviceable. I've seen some people do some crazy things to service these watches. I've seen people just do crazy things to fix them. Parts that have been modified because, again, if you don't understand what's causing the problem, especially in a day drive wheel, it's not the day drive wheel that has the problem. It's actually a clutch in between. It's the intermediate setting wheel that actually has a clutch in it, and that's the wheel that people don't service because they just don't know it exists.
And one of the nice things about the 7750, if I could call this a nice feature, is that it has that wonderful telltale of the rotor wobble that just doesn't end. I mean, there's some unidirectional winders, and you can hear them a little bit. The 7750, it's like, rah, 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 rah. And it's great for counterfeit busting because it's used in Chinese knockoff form as the engine for everything from fake Royal Oak offshores to Panerais to Breitlings. A lot of the most commonly counterfeited chronograph and automatic watches will give themselves away when there's a 7750 wobble on a watch that shouldn't have it.
Exactly, exactly. We've seen them here. We've seen APs come in with 7750s in them, and they still relocate, because the giveaway on a 7750 is your secondhand, your constant secondhands at 9 o'clock. I've seen them move to 12 o'clock.
Yeah, things can be done, but ultimately you can't fake a modular chronograph with pushers out of line, and that's what the Royal Oak is supposed to have.
Right.
So when you stick in a 7750 knockoff, all of a sudden you've got a telltale, and that's before you even shake it.
Well, the big telltale on that too, on the APs, is the calendar disc. They put it directly underneath the dial, where on the fakes it's right underneath the dial. On the real one, you have your little magnifier window.
Yeah.
You get it sitting on top of the base movement.
You should feel like you're staring at your date through a tunnel.
Exactly.
Yeah, and not the tunnel of love, not that kind of date. So the bottom line is that these movements have formed the backbone of the Swiss luxury watch industry for more than 30 years, from the very first 6497 pocket watch chugging its way out of oblivion as a power plant for big oversized watches in the modern era, to the 7750 being elevated to the level of high art. The bottom line is every one of these movements still has a role to play in the industry, and I only think we'll fully appreciate them once the ETA supply is cut off. In about 2 years, we're going to see the end of these, and we'll miss them because In general, they're rugged, they're precise, they're serviceable, they're reliable. Everything you want a movement to do, except maybe be sexy, these do.
They're workhorse movements, and the best thing is you can service them. They're easily serviceable, they're predictable. Yes, there's parts that have to be changed on them. Yes, there's parts that wear out. We see it more in the 7750 than other models. But they're all serviceable. Parts are available. You can put them in. And again, with other companies like Sellita coming out with the SW200, 300, 500 as direct replacements, you have Concepto, which also does the 7750. A lot of brands are starting to use that. It's a little higher of a quality than Sellita, in my opinion. You see, and they're doing some very extravagant stuff with it too. Skeleton Conceptos.
Yeah.
It's just all kinds of crazy stuff.
And Arm & Strom did exceptional things. Look up the Arm & Strom reference 65 to see how far you can take a skeletonized and engraved 2892. Right now there's sort of like a talent contest going on between the manufacturers of knockoffs of these movements. Now, again, all of the intellectual property is expired. Everything that goes into these movements can be duplicated legally, so the only question is, can you make it as well and as cheap and as frequently as ETA? So for the 2824, for instance, we have Sellita jockeying against Valjoux, jockeying against the likes of Hangzhou and Siegel and STP to produce the best legal knockoff of this movement. And it's opened up the gate to a lot of micro manufacturers and movement suppliers that we couldn't have imagined 10, 15 years ago. And it's brought them into the mainstream. So in a way, it's challenged the watch industry to move on from ETA, but also proved how good ETA is at what it does.
When you talk about one brand you just mentioned, Siegel, they make actually a really high quality ETA replacement. I don't even want to call it a counterfeit because, again, it's open now. Anybody can manufacture it because the watch is so old, the movement is so old. So they're not actually trying to copy something; they're making the replacement version of it. The Siegel is actually a very, very high quality.
Yeah, actually, we've got a couple of 6497 Siegel ST36s floating around the office just for fun. And I do want to answer Nana Odoro's question. Longtime viewer asking, am I wearing a non-JLC? That's a fact. Tonight I'm wearing my chronometer grade 2892 in Omega guys as the 1120. And I should mention, some of these movements formed the basis of the first generation of Omega coaxials.
Right.
The 7750 became a coaxial chronograph chronometer.
Right.
In a number of watches, the 2500 was actually a development. I'm going to show you my watch again. The 2500 family was derived from the 2892, and they weren't perfect out of the gate, but considering that they were taking almost science fiction tech into mainstream mass production, growing pains are understandable. And today I think both movements have been more or less corrected.
All the bugs are worked out, and they're fantastic movements to work on, to service everything, A, B, C, D, on the 2500s. One thing I will mention too on the 7750s, you have the different orientations.
Yes.
You have a 7753, 7754, and all that does is it changes where your indicators are, or it adds a calendar. 7753 will actually add a triple date to it.
Yeah, a 7753, exactly like Mike says, it takes the orientation of the chronograph counters and it does this with them.
Yep, moves them like that, and they also put a date across the top. You'll do a triple date on it. And then instead of 7754, same thing, it just moves everything. It moves to the smile version, 369.
And the 2892 spawned an entire universe of movements. You've got the 2892, the basic automatic. You've got the 2893, that's a dual time. You've got the 2894, that's our chrono that we highlighted tonight. You've got the 2895, that's basically the auto with a small second subdial. You've got the 2896, which is the grand date, the double digit. You've got the 2897, which has a power reserve. And if you don't think Bell & Ross loves them some 2892, you got to check out the dashes on their dial. The dash 92 is the 2892. The dash 93 is the 93. And basically they're telling you what's inside, and they love them some 2892.
One of the funny things too, when you talk about the sub-second hand, not a lot of watches actually use them, but it actually has a magnet inside of it. And it has a magnet for the brake on your sub-second hand, and that's just to keep the hand running smoothly, so it doesn't drop, so it doesn't chatter.
Now, I got a question coming in from Robert Wilson. This is one you can answer easily from experience. But he's asking us, and you worked as a lead watchmaker for Breitling at Little Switzerland. The 7750s that Breitling gets in chronometer grade. What's the difference between your base 7750 and that watch in a Breitling timepiece?
A chronometer grade movement, what it's done, it's finished better, and it has the chronometer grade balance in it. The balance is everything. It's finished to a higher level. It's poised better. When I talk about poise, it's the balance of the balance itself, where when you take the hairspring off, it's the way it's weighted, where it's finer tuned than the regular. There is a difference in the balances. Maybe next week we'll go through that. We'll bring out a couple of different balances and we'll demonstrate the difference in the chronometer grade balance and the non-chronometer grade balance. So all Breitlings, they do have the higher grade balance in it, and again, it's a much more expensive. A lot of it has to do with the way the watch is assembled, how the watchmaker assembles the watch, because again, even though you have a base movement, a non-chronometer base, you can still get chronometer specs out of that watch. It's not much different. One of the things they do too on Breitling, they use same thing as Omega, they use a better finished screw, where they're rolled screws, but they use the heads of the screws are actually polished. They're finished very nicely. It's a lot more expensive screw than the throwaway, just rolled stamped screws.
And you're going to get a higher grade hairspring, a Niverox 1 hairspring. So there's a lot that's different. There's a huge difference between the old 1970s U.S. import market 17 jewel 7750s. Like Mike said, hardly any of those even run anymore.
Right.
And what you're seeing in a Breitling as a caliber 13 chronograph. That's a much higher grade of 7750.
One of the things you see too when you talk about Breitling, when you look at the numbers, like Tim just said, caliber 13 is the Breitling caliber. The middle number tells you it's chronometer grade if it's a 3. The older ones were 0. Those were non-chronometer grade. It's going to be a 17 jewel 7750. So once you start seeing that 3, that's when they went to the chronometer grade movement.
Exactly. When you look on the back case of a Breitling, you'll see that number that starts. It'll be like A is steel, 1-3 is the caliber 13 chronograph, and then the 3 after that. 3 means chronometer, 0 means non-chronometer, and since 2000, they're all chronometers.
And the last 2 numbers, they're just the reference of what the watch looks like.
Okay. And Robert Wilson, just to answer your follow-up question, at this point, Breitling is only taking delivery of complete ETA calibers, just like everyone else. Kits are no longer delivered, and components are no longer delivered piecemeal. You have to order the whole movement. Actual, like, knockdown kit supply, it ended quite a while ago, per the Swiss government-endorsed phase-out of ETA components, kits, and whole movements. So Mike,
one of the things too, let me touch on this real quick, just because we touched on the B01 so much. Hublot also has the Unico movement, which was designed as a replacement for the 7750 when everybody knew the 7750 was going away. It's not an exact drop-in. You can't just take an Unico and drop it in to a Big Bang or a Breitling or anything else that had a 7750. The movement's a little thicker. The orientation of the pushers and the crown, everything else is the same. The dial feet are the same. The hands are the same. But they made the movement thicker. The Unico itself is an in-house design movement by Hublot. And it's designed differently. It's designed to run different. Where the minute recorder runs actually off of the barrel. It doesn't run off the train. It's not a forced drive. It's not going to actually push the minute recorder across like a 7750 will, because when it does that, when anything pushes across, it actually lowers some of the amplitude and it can slow the watch down just for that flick. So what the Unico was designed to do, it actually designed to run off the barrel, so when you engage the chronograph, it engages not only the chronograph hand, but it engages the minute recorder as well, and they run completely independent off each other. And that was one of the interesting things.
And that's actually a measure that a lot of more innovative modern movement designers have taken, running elements of the chronograph directly off the barrel. That's what F.P. Journe does with the Sontigraph to avoid the loss of balance amplitude, and Hublot's doing that too with the Unicos. Well, the Unico's had its teething problems, so is the reference 1506 in the Sontigraph. That one was a disaster when it first came out. So no one's immune to new movement issues. Fortunately, they've all got them under control at this point. And if you're lucky enough to get a Jean-Claude Biver extended warranty, you got a keepsake too.
Absolutely.
He's actually written out extended warranties to clients who bought their watches and asked him for one. It's great because then you get this little thing signed by him. Take 5 years of warranty.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Here's your free 5-year warranty, exactly.
Okay.
That doesn't mean you can destroy your watch and they'll fix it though.
No. Depends on how well you know them, I guess.
Yeah.
So, guys, thanks for joining us tonight. I really appreciate all your questions. I want to give a shout out to my producer, Pheline, who keeps me on topic and on time and decorates our screen with graphics. I want to give a shout out to my man, Federico, who's been manning the live chat box. This is going to be a permanent feature of my broadcasts going forward, and when he does his, I'm going to man the chat box for him. But we want to make sure that we answer all your questions as well as we can. I saw quite a few that neither of us was able to get to. I have not forgotten, guys. So tomorrow, Federico is going to be broadcasting. He's not going to be doing live, but he's going to be doing the same format that you've come to know and love on Federico Talks Watches. You can reach him, Federico, at Watch You Want. You can reach me, Tim, at Watch You Want. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you like the content you see here. Also, look for us on Instagram and Facebook, because right now Federico is managing both of those for us. So you've got 3 great ways to reach out to Fed: by email, Instagram, and Facebook. Either way, I should say all 3 ways, he's going to get your message. I want to thank Mike Michaels.
Thanks, Tim.
My pleasure. He'll be back next Wednesday for our Watchmaker Wednesday feature. Until then, I'm Mike. I'm Mike. Am I?
No, you're Tim. I'm Mike.
I'm co-opting. There we go. Copyright infringement notwithstanding, I'm Tim. He's Mike. He's Federico. She's Pheline. I've got a crowd. This is Watch You Want.